It's time for you to learn about informational autocracy, because authoritarianism today looks very different from authoritarianism during most of the 20th century, which means it looks very different from the examples that most of you studied in school. And if a majority of people think something looks one way and in reality it looks very different, they're not going to see it coming. Outside of a couple of my videos, there's a good chance that the term informational autocracy is new to you, because it's new. In fact, as far as I can tell, it was first proposed in 2019 by researchers Sergei Guriev and Daniel Treisman. This is the breakdown of their research paper that I've been promising for a couple of months. Since we're at a point where in very rapid succession, we have seen control being exerted over our media, prosecution of political enemies, and even the suggestion that using the word authoritarian is in and of itself a problem, it's time. I'm going to go through every section of this paper. If you're watching this on verticals, I'm sorry to do this, but I'm going to split this into a few sections. If you want to watch it in full, all in one go, it will be up on the horizontal platform. Hi YouTube, it's me from the future. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. So without further ado, I'm going to quote the paper to start. The model of dictatorship that dominated in the 20th century was based on fear. Totalitarians, like the big ones you know and love to hate, I hope, famously terrorized their citizens and were very public about their brutality to keep opposition in line. Their regimes were defined by a combination of repression and ideological indoctrination, often isolating their citizens from the rest of the world with censorship and limitations on international travel and trade. However, if you think of the authoritarians of more recent decades, you'll note that they rely a lot less on overt and widespread brutality, strict indoctrination. They also don't fully cut off their citizens from the rest of the world. Many of them on the surface even look like and act like democracies. So this paper looks at the data on these changes and tries to identify exactly how these authoritarians are maintaining their power without these traditional tools. They posit that this new era of authoritarianism relies far, far more on the manipulation of information above all else. They also propose this theory of what they call an informed elite, where part of the population is educated and aware enough to understand exactly what's going on, where the general public is more susceptible to be manipulated by the misinformation and propaganda. They also point out that while a lot of their examples suggest an overlap between populism and informational autocracy, that's not always exclusively true. While populism is a general set of specific beliefs, informational autocracy is a method of rule, which can be used or combined with a variety of messages or belief systems. If you're assuming that authoritarianism is going to be very obviously brutal and repressive, you're wrong. Informational autocrats substitute the overt violence that is traditionally associated with authoritarianism with more sophisticated forms of information manipulation. So after the introduction and overview, which I went over in part 1, the paper dives into examining the rate and role of violence in informational autocracies. Overt brutality by dictators is on the decline and has been for a few decades now. First, they looked at state-sponsored political killings, those of non-violent individuals committed by agents of the state for political or ideological reasons, including the indiscriminate targeting of protesters and unarmed civilians by police, military, or security forces, but excluding two-sided violence. So when looking at the average number of these losses per year under each autocrat, based on the decade when these dictators came into power, there was a pretty steady increase starting in the 1950s, with an even steeper decrease starting in the 1980s. Even when controlling for other potential explanations, like the decrease in civil wars, which increase other types of violence, the change and decrease actually becomes even more pronounced. Political prisoners and detainees have also been coming down since the 70s, as well as allegations of torture of political prisoners. It also appears as though individual leaders have adapted while in office. Under Peru's President Fujimori, intelligence chief Montesinos started out with death squads and later preferred indirect methods. So when someone suggested threatening a TV magnate, he said, quote, "Remember why Pinochet had his problems. We will not be so clumsy." Instead, chose to strip him of his citizenship and let regulations and the law do the rest. And this is where it starts to feel a little more familiar. Instead of long sentences for dissidents, now a lot of rulers prefer short ones. Fidel Castro held some dissidents for over 10 years. His brother Raul preferred to hold people for just a few days, just enough to intimidate without attracting a bunch of attention. Russia and Morocco use preventative short-term detentions to disrupt opposition organizing. Other tools are house arrest, job loss, denial of housing, educational opportunities, travel documents, all of which can be cast more easily as non-political. Thanks to new surveillance technology, the ability to identify and target potential disruptors has become a lot easier. So basically, authoritarianism is getting far less brutal or overtly repressive. Decreased violence may increase longevity for a dictator, making it more likely that instead of being overthrown, they will retire retire safely or live out the rest of their years in power. But remember, it's not just the amount of violence that has changed, it's the way in which it's used. Traditionally, brutality would often be advertised in all of the ghoulish ways you can imagine, because it's not just a tool being used on the victims, it's a tool being used on the observers as well. Franco in Spain, for example, had a phrase, garrote y prensa, which basically meant garrote and press. Coverage. It is meant to spread fear. Quote, in traditional dictatorships, especially those with limited state capacity, the horror of punishments must compensate for the relatively limited probability that disloyal acts will be detected. Mao said, quote, we want to be shocking. Pakistan's General Zia-ul-Haq said, quote, martial law should be based on fear. This is exactly what I talked about a while back. An army doesn't have to be logistically more powerful than a population to control it if fear can do 90% of the work for it. Making an example out of someone can be a very effective deterrent. But in informational autocracies, this doesn't work in the exact same way. Because remember, and we'll dive into this a bit more later, but in many ways they are mimicking democracies. So overt brutality can actually puncture through that image or facade, and it's far more likely to lead to protests and insider defections. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine, 1980s Poland, and in fact it's far more likely to backfire in countries with higher income and opposition media. This part's important. Informational autocrats have several ways of disguising or camouflaging the acts of repression that they do commit. For example, prosecuting political dissidents for non-political, preferably embarrassing crimes, as opposed to openly prosecuting them for being dissidents. For example, Ceausescu in Romania instructed his security chief to use, quote, inventiveness and creativity in neutralizing dissidents. Quote, we can arrest them as embezzlers or speculators, accuse them of dereliction of their professional duties, or whatever else best fits each case. Once a fellow's in prison, he's yours. Recent dictators have charged political opponents with all sorts of things, including corruption, adultery, disrupting traffic, stealing street art, and illegal elk hunting. As it turns out, sometimes it's easier to get away with being a tyrant or dictator if you're not being super obvious about it. Plausible deniability is king, especially in a world where people have access to resources and education. But it also makes sense from the point of view of a population, if you think about it. At a certain point, a population that's living under an extremely brutal regime is going to figure that a civil war can't be that much worse. But again, some people, probably a lot of them, will be fooled. And this is another part we're going to dive into a lot more deeply a little later. But this is that idea that I mentioned in the intro about an informed elite that understands what's going on versus the general public that's going to have a harder time seeing through it. But also, very relevantly, if people are educated to understand authoritarianism as looking one specific way, and the system they exist in is missing all of those hallmarks, there's a very good chance that they're not going to see it for what it is. Because hey, don't dictators just imprison a bunch of people for disagreeing with them? Isn't it a lot more dangerous to oppose the regime? Surely without those things, everything must be fine. This isn't authoritarianism. You see how we get here? Yeah. Anyway, it gets a lot more interesting when we stop talking so much about what informational autocracy doesn't do and start talking more about what it does. Ideology is often a complement of repression, but the role of ideology in authoritarianism has been shifting for several decades. This is a good point to mention that you may notice elements of both traditional authoritarianism and informational autocracy feel familiar. And I do have a couple of theories that would explain the sort of mix in certain places right now, which I might go over at the very end. But remember, as mentioned in the previous section, some autocrats adapt over the course of their tenure. So as we just went over, informational autocracy is far less overtly repressive than traditional authoritarianism from the 20th century. And as I quoted at the beginning, ideology is often a complement of repression. So for example, totalitarian systems would often use a holistic or comprehensive ideology that both legitimized the dictator and the system, basically required personal sacrifice from the population. There would also be non-totalitarian autocrats that would adopt guiding doctrines. For example, forms or elements of Catholicism or Marxism. Part of the reason ideology is such an important component to this is that almost all of them define regime opponents as evil, which justifies and motivates harsh punishments against them. So the ideology legitimizes and encourages support for the repression. However, because informational autocrats are far less dependent on mass repression, they don't have as much use for this sort of comprehensive ideology. So again, when we look at the numbers for post-war non-democracies with an official ideology, there's an incredibly steep drop-off from 42% in 1983 to around 20% in the 1990s and 2000s. So it's pretty obvious why a dictator wouldn't want democratic institutions around them, including things like legal opposition parties. Not only could it challenge their power or decision-making, but it also allows for opposition to coordinate and grow. And yet, we are seeing more and more authoritarian systems and dictators start to include these democratic institutions, which seems counterintuitive. conservative. While in 1975, almost half of non-democracies had no elected legislator at all, by 2015, more than 2/3 had parliaments in which non-government parties had at least a token presence. So instead of outright rejecting democracy like previous ideologies, a lot of them insist on more conditional forms of democracy, often pointing to Western democracy as having problems that they are solving for. For example, Orbán's concept of illiberal democracy in Hungary. He and his party have changed the system in order to consolidate their own power. First by weakening the judiciary, then the press, creating a media council to oversee radio and TV stations, using heavy fines to bankrupt stations that don't censor themselves heavily enough on criticism of the government. When Orbán's wealthy friends got even wealthier off of government contracts and the like, they started buying up not just TV and radio stations, but also print media, which then conveniently became third-party vehicles for the state, or got fully shut down with questionable claims of unprofitability. But hey, technically all the media is not state-run. Then he moved on to the electoral system. So technically, while it appears in many ways to be a democracy, Orbán says, no, it's a special kind of democracy, an illiberal democracy. In Russia, you have what they call a sovereign democracy. And by that, they mean that any questioning or doubting of the validity of the democracy is actually outside interference and isn't allowed to be part of the system. Or for example, Chavismo under Chavez focused more on social causes. Basically, instead of relying on brainwashing an entire population or controlling thought, and instead of inciting that fear that we talked about, the rulers are pretending to act in the best interest of their citizens. Authoritarian leaders have also been taking office using democratic means more often. Between the 70s cohort and 2000s cohort, the percentage of those who were elected into power went from 14 to 56%. There's also been a trend towards making these elections look more and more credible. Instead of banning opposition parties outright, they permit them but then harass candidates and manipulate the media to ensure large victories. Between the 90s and 2012, there was also a stark rise in alleged media bias favoring the incumbent. And in order to get external legitimacy, they'll invite in international monitors that focus on the immediate period, but tend to ignore the longer-term policies that disadvantage challengers. Since the 80s, the percentage of these elections that have been monitored has gone from 26 to 84%. Again, it's all about plausible deniability. And this is why when people say that they don't think there will be another election in this country, I always say, no, I'm pretty sure there will be. And in fact, with a population that is uneducated and susceptible enough, you don't even need to mess with anything on the day. If you control the media, you control the narrative. If you control the narrative, you control the people. Next, we're going to go even deeper on what this narrative is and how it's constructed. We tend to assume that a population will automatically or overall disapprove of authoritarianism, but that's not actually true. And in fact, informational autocrats can actually be pretty popular. Informational autocrats hold onto power through manipulation of information, yes, but it's not that simple. They actually have to be careful to strike the perfect balance, because more manipulation of information isn't always effective, and in fact can actually backfire. This, in my opinion, is probably the most important part to understand. And I'm going to pull from a couple of other papers by Guriev and Treisman because they go into more detail on this. They have proposed a formula of sorts to understand what level and type of information manipulation is going to be most effective based on certain factors. One of the factors, unsurprisingly, is education of the public, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. So one of the possible explanations for this increase in informational autocracy over traditional authoritarianism is the fact that the world is better educated and more developed. Because as it turns out, the more educated a population is, the less likely they are to like authoritarianism. Shocker. I know. So there are a few pieces to this equation. First, you have a leader that can be competent or incompetent. Competence can mean a million different things, but in this case, we're talking about things that generally improve the standard of living. We're talking strong economies, growth, development, education, government services, etc. A big problem, however, as you've probably deduced, is that competence in authoritarianism can often be slightly self-defeating, because the more developed your country becomes, the better educated your people are, the more likely they are to want democracy. Across the board, a population prefers a competent leader. And people are going to perceive competence a couple of ways, right? Number one, the experience of their own life. And number two, through the information they're receiving about, the government and how things are going, the economy. Are the jobs numbers doing great? In traditional authoritarianism, propaganda and censorship are, of course, used, but differently. Obvious censorship, like book burnings, is intimidating. It keeps people in line. However, in informational autocracies, the goal is to actually keep the population convinced. against. How do you do that? Well, first you have propaganda. I'm so great, look at this wonderful job I'm doing. Any sort of negatives you blame on outside forces, foreign adversaries or the opposition. If you're competent, then it's all fine and dandy, right? You have the numbers and evidence to back you up. However, if you're incompetent and you plan on holding on to power despite that incompetence, you need people not to realize that. So of course you can do things like blame the opposition, but that's only going to get you so far. And if you don't have the evidence and numbers to back that up, people are going to realize that, and that's a problem. So you can start faking the numbers or massaging them, let's say, making them a little bit less available. But the more educated your population is, the more likely they are to realize that that's what you're doing, and the more likely they are to call it out. And that's where censorship comes in. So this model basically looks at these pieces. People like a competent leader. People do not, however, like censorship or manipulation of information. Number one, it suggests that there's something to hide, which suggests incompetence. A competent leader doesn't need to hide what they're doing. But also, obvious censorship can actually prompt people to seek out the information that's being hidden. So they categorized populations into two groups: the informed elite and the general population. The informed elite is basically the part of the population that is educated enough and attentive enough to be able to observe the type and competence of the leader. The general population is perhaps less educated, less attentive, as well as more likely to fall for manipulated information and less likely to recognize censorship and manipulation of information when they encounter it. So the problem is, in a more developed and more highly educated nation, the informed elite is going to be larger. The larger your informed elite is, the more important it is to monopolize the media. The informed elite is also likely to try to send signals to the general population about what's really going on. If they see censorship and information manipulation, they will call it out. The simplest form of thinking of this is journalism. So the leader needs to stop the informed elite from informing the general public as much as possible. And the more free the media is, the easier it is for them to get their information out. However, remember, the information you're trying to stop them from transmitting is the numbers are fake, things are not as good as you think they are, and this guy isn't either. But if the censorship is too obvious, you're accidentally letting the general population know half of the stuff that you're trying to hide. If they see that there's censorship, they're going to ask what you're hiding, and they're going to try to seek it out. For example, people that come up against the Great Firewall are more likely to find ways to jump it than individuals who exist on a technically open internet but encounter a little bit of friction on the way to getting certain information. As soon as someone figures out that you're trying to hide something from them, they want to know what it is, which, by the way, is something that a lot of peddlers of misinformation have used to their advantage. So informational autocrats will try to use indirect methods of media censorship and information manipulation. In addition to censorship, another thing they can do is co-opting the informed elites, or at least part of them, which basically means making it so that their interests are aligned with your success as an authoritarian. So a media company, for example, may be not just afraid of the consequences, but want to enjoy the rewards of being on the authoritarian's good side. If they keep it cool, then no harm, no foul, and they might even make more money. However, again, the larger the informed elite, the harder it is to co-opt the full informed elite. And they are far more likely to support democracy, even if they materially benefit more from authoritarianism. You can buy some of them off, but not all of them. For example, in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew co-opted shareholders in key media companies. Members of the supposedly independent boards then did the censoring for him. When loyalty failed, he punished offending journalists with lawsuits. In one analyst's words, forsaken profits and stiff legal penalties have been more effective in fostering self-censorship than earlier methods of intimidation. Orban in Hungary starved critical radio stations of state advertising, leaving them vulnerable to takeovers by government allies. Moreover, if censored sparingly, social networks can be used by the state as a tool of surveillance. When informational autocrats do admit to censorship or are caught, they often claim to be protecting citizens from extremism, vandalism, and other harmful things. So in summary, authoritarianism today more likely than not wants you complacent more than afraid. It wants you uninformed rather than brainwashed. It looks more like democracy than totalitarianism unless you look closely. And people looking closely is its entire vulnerability. They want you to self-censor. They want you to stop trying to bring attention to what's happening, especially to those who aren't yet seeing it. They don't want to be the ones to silence you because silencing you draws attention. Now, as I said in one of the earlier parts, some people are going to say, but this right now feels like it's a mix of these tactics. And yes, there are a couple of potential explanations for that. Number one, as stated, tactics can evolve over an authoritarian's tenure. Number two, which I didn't didn't dive into as much, but is mentioned in the research. Sometimes there are competing strategies involved. Often members of security forces want to use more directly repressive methods. Others may want to use more ideological ones, and those conflicts can come to a head. I think, however, that those different approaches, while there may be friction behind the scenes, are still working in tandem as they're more or less effective on different parts of the population. But also, and this is a bigger theory that I have talked about before, my fear of the undetected informational autocracy that I believe we are headed towards is not so much under Trump. Once it's all broken, whoever steps in next is going to have plausible deniability for anything they do. Because no matter what it is, I can almost guarantee it's going to feel like an improvement. And that feeling of an improvement is where the danger lies. It's going to garner a lot of support. And that is the moment when people stop paying close attention. For now, don't let them silence you in advance.